The video you just watched, you heard a man tell the story of arriving at Auschwitz and watching his daughter's little red coat get smaller and smaller until he couldn't see it anymore. He never saw his daughter again. We know the story because he was a witness stand at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961. But something happened after the man gave his testimony that day, which created the most riveting scene of the entire trial. The young Israeli prosecutor, Gabriel Bach, was standing at his chair when the man finished. But he couldn't continue his questioning. The courtroom fell silent, and Bach just stood there. Finally, the judge told Bach to continue. And again, he was unable to speak. Years later, Bach explained that fate would have it. He and his wife had just brought their 3-year-old daughter a little red coat. And on this day, if he goes into a restaurant or is walking down a street in Jerusalem and he sees a young girl in a little red coat, his throat will tense up and he can't speak. I think after the last month, we all saw ourselves and our children and grandchildren through the victims of October 7th. Now, if you are Jewish, how could you not? I know this is a difficult way to welcome you here tonight as we gather here to honor two incredible individuals with the World Jewish Congress Theodore Herzl and Teddy Kollek Award. Former Canadian Prime Minister and statesman Brian Mulroney and the brilliant New York Times columnist Bret Stephens. Both strong defenders of Israel and the Jewish people. But tonight's Herzl dinner is different from all others. For the first time since we began this tradition, we gather as Israel is fighting in a major war. For the first time, we mourn the greatest single loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. For the first time in our lives, we are witnessing the explosion of violent anti-Semitism throughout the world, and right here in New York City, and especially on college campuses. Tonight, I'd like to talk about how this happened to our great universities and colleges, what it means for our future. In June 1990, I gave a speech at the King David Hotel, and I talked about what I was starting to see happening in our schools throughout America. There was a dangerous rise of anti-Semitism and the targeting of Israel as one of the world's great evils in the world. I remember suggesting at that time that Israel needed to buy one less F-15 and use the money for Hezbollah, and the UJA needed to focus some of its American donations on the spread of anti-Semitism right here. I tried to do this on my own, but in those days, I did not have a platform to get my point across. The fact is, this hatred towards Israel has been smoldering for 40 years, along with the slow but steady erosion of our great universities. Colleges that were the envy of the world, colleges that trained future generations of Americans who built up bridges, cured disease, and created the foundation of the world's strongest economy. This radicalization of education began in the 1960s with a few public intellectuals like Herbert Marcuse, a German-American professor who developed the idea that free speech was only for Marxist views. But any speech that disagreed with those views was not allowed. One of his best students was Angela Davis. But it wasn't until the 1970s, 80s that these seeds began to take root. A new generation of professors who were radicalized by the Vietnam War eventually took over their departments and choked off any opposing points of view in the PhD pipeline. Howard Zinn's new view of American history as colonialist and racist filtered down to secondary education. Remember the name Bill Ayers? He was one of the founding members of the Weather Underground that bombed buildings across the country. Ayers should have gone to prison, but the FBI botched his case, and he went free. Ayers went back to school, got a degree in education, and has had a huge influence on the books that elementary students read. So by the 1980s, when I gave the speech at the King David Hotel, I had seen what was happening. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that something else started to happen, and it's important. Foreign and radical left money started coming into our elite schools as a way to push a negative influence towards Israel. This worked in tandem with a new generation of radical professors who were very open to their ideas. The universities were all too very open to receive this money. Shortly after 2000, the money began to flow in greater and greater and larger amounts. According to the Free Press, at least 200 American colleges have illegal withheld information on $13 billion in undisclosed contributions from foreign regimes. This flood of new wealth was especially evident in the Middle East studies departments, where professors from the Middle East were trained and eventually cut out anyone who might see Israel in a positive way. This radicalization also focused on the humanities, which removed the core curriculum of Western civilization and replaced it with a simplest view that the world was divided into two groups, the oppressors and the oppressed. Israel and wealthy Jews fell in the category of oppressors, which is exactly how Marxists and National Socialists saw Jews. But it was slow and quiet. I talked about it, but no one was listening, mostly because they were still excited to have their children and grandchildren in the top schools. Then around 2016, Jewish enrollment suddenly started to drop. If a child was from a Jewish high school, their chance of getting into these universities was very low. And no one complained. As I said, this began to filter down also to secondary and even elementary schools. Here's a case point. Last year, a children's novel entitled A Little Piece of Ground by a British children's author, Elizabeth Laird, told the story of a 12-year-old boy in Ramallah whose father was killed by Israeli soldiers. The one thing that made him happy was playing soccer, but Israeli soldiers would not let him play. A metaphor for larger issues. Israel denied Palestinians their little piece of ground. This was required reading for sixth graders in Newark, New Jersey. When I heard about it and called the governor of New Jersey, there was no reaction because he didn't think it was important. It took 3 more calls until he finally understood that it was important, and he had the book taken off the reading list. But imagine that book times thousands read by 12-year-olds across the country. At the same time, These same schools were bearing the story of Anne Frank. So we shouldn't be surprised that students today march for harmless terrorists and march against the victims of the terror. We shouldn't be surprised that students pull down signs of kidnapped Jewish children who they see as complacent in the suppression. By the end, there's also something positive that came from this horrific program on October 7th. First and foremost, Israel is unified as we've never seen it before, and the IDF will defend the Jewish state. The Jewish people around the world are unified as well in their support for Israel. And here at home, people are finally aware of the anti-Semitism on college campuses and everything that has taken place over the past 30 years. Major funders, including myself, have stopped donating to schools that will not adequately address the hatred of and harassment of Jewish students. Quite frankly, if you went to Harvard, Penn, Tulane, Yale, Georgetown, you name it, send your money elsewhere. Give it to Jewish causes. We all have to make these institutions aware of what they are doing. When 50% of Americans under 30, 50% believe that socialism is better than capitalism, it's time we woke up. Finally, I want to remind you of something that it's all too easy to forget. We are overwhelmed by the volume of pro-Hamas demonstrators outside, or the squad in Congress, or the biased reporting of most of our media. The anti-Zionists and anti-Semites are not greater in number. They are just louder. We forget this, especially when we live in Washington, Boston corridor. There is a great, big, wonderful country out there between the two coasts. It's filled with honest, hardworking, working people who are generous and good. Every single poll, the vast majority of Americans support Israel and stand with the Jewish people, and by huge numbers. Just yesterday, President George W. Bush spoke out, and he said, there is only one villain in this conflict, and it's not Israel. President Biden could not be more supportive. He has been outstanding. We are not alone. There is support from both sides of the aisle. Remember this. We are not alone. We are not alone. May God continue to bless Israel and the United States of America and Canada. And may God bless all of you. I wanted to thank my co-chairs, Jello Saffer and David Rothschild, for their continued and much valued support and friendship. I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.